I want to just have a conversation about the origins of our country. What is Americanism? What is it that conservatives are even trying to conserve? And I would answer that by saying, well, it's the American founding. The American founding is what we're trying to conserve. Now, there's a series of policy outcomes that we'd like that are associated with that, but those are derivative. Right? Those come next, and they change every so often. It kind of depends on what's in the heat of the moment, frankly, what's in current events. But any policy issue that we land on, any position that we land on, it always comes from a sense of the founding, a sense of foundations. And foundations are important. I like to paint a picture for people when they try to present a dichotomy between the left and the right. And I want you to imagine a librarian, right? And this librarian represents America. This librarian represents America, always trying to strive for something greater. She's trying to get to that top shelf of books where all the best knowledge is, where the best way to live is, where we have the ultimate amount of prosperity. You might even call it utopia. But utopia is Greek for no such place, a place you can never have. So it's dangerous to be striving for utopia, but we want to get better nonetheless, and maybe that's something the left and the right can agree on. We always want to get better. The difference is what the right does is we stack books beneath that librarian, and she keeps getting higher and higher and higher, and those books are the American founding. They're foundations. They're things like free speech, right? Real basic principles. They're things like a republic versus a mob democracy. These basic principles that we've learned over the years, through thousands of years of trial and error. They're things like the importance of a meritocracy. Things like personal responsibility as a virtue in and of itself, as a bedrock for a society that can live free. Things like a Judeo-Christian moral framework that kind of at least anchors us. It gives us some insight on what right looks like. Otherwise, you're just sort of flailing in the wind, kind of deciding what is moral based on the societal whims of any given moment. And as you stack these foundations atop of each other, you eventually reach higher and higher and higher, and you're reaching for that ultimate prosperity. But the left doesn't see it that way necessarily, or at least they don't act that way. Because instead what they do is they see that top shelf and they see utopia. And utopia is, it draws you in, right? It's like a moth to a flame. Utopia is very seductive, especially to young people. It kind of tells you why I think young people vote Democrat so much. Because utopia is seductive. Revolution is seductive. It's very romantic to talk about revolution and getting somewhere better. You could have it all if only these greedy conservatives will just let you. Right? This is how they talk about things. And they get frustrated because they can't ever reach utopia. It's never good enough. And so what do? They take a match and they burn the foundations beneath them that they're standing upon because they're upset. And they think it's those foundations' fault. They think that because we don't have utopia, because it's impossible, because you never will, they think that because we don't have that, it must be America's fault. So if you're trying to understand, I think, the psychology of why we are where we are, where it seems like we're in this battle for the country, this cultural battle, where there's a side that doesn't like America or anything about it, and a side that does. And even the New York Times acknowledges this. I remember an article recently where the title was you can tell, these days you can tell exactly who votes where based on whether or not they have an American flag in their front yard. And unfortunately, that strikes me as more and more true. And that is unfortunate, right? I'd like to see us all go back to the times post 9/11 when everybody had an American flag out, where it wasn't considered this symbol of racism or hate or oppression or whatever it is the far left likes to label it as these days. And it's worth noting, it is the far left. I think you probably have plenty of Democrat friends that don't necessarily feel that way, that don't identify with that kind of talk. But nevertheless, it is driving a lot of the conversation. And I increasingly hear from my Democrat friends, look, I do love my country, I just want to really change it a lot. Imagine telling your spouse that. Like, I love you so much, I just want everything about you to be different. Like, it works really well. Of course it doesn't work, because that's not love, right? Love is some form of acceptance. It doesn't mean there's no change. It doesn't mean conservatives are afraid of change. It just means that we operate and we desire that change based on a set of limiting principles. We want to solve problems within a framework of limiting principles. We want to ask certain questions like, should government even be doing this? Right? That's a pretty good first question to ask. We might ask, is it even a problem? A lot of problems are kind of made up. Like, for instance, the police being systemically racist. That's a made-up problem. It just is. It's statistically, from the data, intuitively, in all aspects, it's a made-up problem. And so before we go taking action on a made-up problem, we might want to ask, is it a made-up problem? The issue of climate change is similar but different. It's not exactly a made-up problem. It's just not as big of a problem as the left says it is. I'm going to give you a stat if you ever want to debate somebody on climate change, if that's just what you do with your weekends. But always go back to the scientific consensus that they want to use, and that's the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. This report is actually good science. It's actually good science, right? And it goes into a lot of detail. One of the most salient details that I like to point out is climate change will have a cost. But here's what the cost looks like, and let me lay it out this way. By the year 2100, world GDP will increase by about 450%, just on the trajectory we're on. Everybody's going to get richer. Everybody's going to be better off. That's the natural progression of humanity. Because of the cost of climate change, however, it will be less. It will be 434% increase. So there's a cost, and it's not nothing, but it's pretty close to nothing. And we might be better off investing in ways to adapt to climate change, levees and such, and just infrastructure. This is the reason I bring up that example is because we constantly see this refrain from the left where they try to get you to believe in some kind of crisis, and you say, okay, well, maybe. I mean, I agree there might be a problem here. I'm not sure if it's a crisis, but sure, there's a problem. And then they say, well, not only is there a crisis, but we need to do these crazy solutions in order to solve it. And then conservatives say, oh, I'm not so sure about that. That seems like a bit of overreach. And then the left says, see, you don't care about the problem. And this game happens over and over and over again. And you see it on every issue. But the reason conservatism is, I think, a better governing philosophy is because we ask those questions. Should government solve it? Is this fiscally sustainable? What will it do to our fiscal trajectory? Can we afford it? Where should this problem be solved? At the local level, the state level, the federal level? Shouldn't we have that conversation before we just decide that Congress should do everything? These are reasonable questions that only conservatives really ask. Does it have second and third order consequences? If you do this nice thing, what other bad things might happen? Have we thought through that? Should we go about this more incrementally, more carefully? Again, these are basic questions. If you give somebody a service and say, call healthcare a right, well, who has to provide that service? Do you therefore have to infringe on the rights of others in order to provide something to someone else? And really, are you just pitting people against each other? You see this play out all the time, whether it's the gun control debate, right? You want to make some people feel safe, and it is just a feeling. But then you have to infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens in order to do that. So the left doesn't think through these basic principles of individual rights, these basic principles of inalienable rights. They don't think through it, not at all. Like I said, it takes place with healthcare as well. It takes place with conversations like reparations. And reparations is the most salient, I think, example of this kind of wrong-headed philosophy where you want to pit one group against another and effectively bribe them into voting for you. And if you want to understand how the Democrats come to this point where we're now looking at spending $3.5 trillion, it's actually more, it was, depending on how you estimate it, probably closer to $5 trillion. How do you get to that point? How do you get to such an enormous number? I read a good article recently that laid out the numbers here. And I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but I think it's something like this. A million seconds ago was like last September. 1 billion seconds ago was like the 1970s or 80s. 1 trillion seconds ago, no human had ever built a house, had ever written a word, nothing. That's how long 1 trillion seconds ago is compared to 1 million. It's a lot of money, and it's kind of unfathomable. Unfathomable? And how do we get to that point? And, you know, Americans care, but they don't care that much. They don't care as much as they should. I'm not even sure the Freedom Caucus in our Congress cares about debt anymore. I never hear them talk about it. They certainly didn't challenge Trump on it. So who cares about it? It's hard to get people to care because it seems like every time we spend more money, nothing bad happens. Now, that's changing a little bit. We have sky-high inflation. We've got a lot of problems. We spent $6 trillion last year. We have large inflation now. It's not just because of the spending. It's for a bunch of reasons. But I think maybe, hopefully, I'm hoping people are a little bit more skeptical about it. But the truth is that bribery is a really powerful tool in politics. You know, Alex de Tocqueville said that the end of the Alex de Tocqueville is that Frenchman who toured the United States and wrote about life here. It's really interesting writing from a foreigner's perspective. And one of the things he said, I think, or at least is attributed to him, is that the end of the republic is when politicians figure out that they can bribe you with your own money. That's absolutely true. It's why we don't have necessarily a mob democracy, you know, a pure democracy, where 51% of the population, 51% of this room could vote that the other 49% don't get dessert. And it's democracy. You know, if you want to know what Democrats stand for, it's often pure democracy. Republicans stand for the preservation of a republic. There's a reason for that. Hell, I'm not even sure Democrats believe in democracy anymore. I keep seeing all these tweets from guys like Bernie Sanders and a bunch of far-left activists. They keep getting really mad at Manchin and Sinema. And they're saying, how could 2 senators hold this entire movement hostage? As if there's not 50 other Republican senators that now cause a majority. Like, they just ignore that little fact, that tiny little fact, as if it's 2 people out of 100 that are holding them back. Of course, that's not what's happening. I mean, do they think we're stupid? And the answer is yes, they do. They've moved on from being pure majoritarians where they say, look, we won 51%, so we can do whatever we want. I mean, that's crazy enough. That's not what our founders intended. They intended a system with checks and balances. So that's crazy enough, but they've actually gone beyond that to saying, we're just really nice people, so you should do whatever we say. That's where we're at right now. At least it seems to me that way. And that's because they know that bribery is a powerful tool. And if we're going to save the republic, we have to convince Americans that they should not be bribed by the false promises of big government. That's the best way to save the republic. Remind people of the foundations of personal responsibility and fortitude that allow us to live in a free country. I want to get to that in a second. But bribery is a powerful tool. So what are they bribing you with in this case? Well, I'm not sure they're bribing Texans with much because they're threatening a lot of our jobs. They're threatening to destroy the Texas oil and gas industry through a methane tax, which is really just a natural gas tax. They're threatening to basically put us on a path to Medicare for all. And they do this by expanding Obamacare unsustainably. They do this by expanding Medicaid and Medicare unsustainably so that they'll go insolvent and eventually just have to add more government to it. Like that's basically the plan. And they offer you things, right? They offer you, it doesn't really matter how much money you make, even for upper middle class, they're offering free childcare, free this, free that, free checks if you have a kid. If you make under $800,000 a year, they'll offer you $12,500 for your electric vehicle. I'm sure a lot of you guys are driving your electric vehicles around a lot. So it's not meant for you. See, that bribery isn't meant for you. It's meant for the elites who live on coasts and live in cities and can actually deal with an electric car. It doesn't work so well out here. That's what it's for. It's for massive, massive subsidies, as if we haven't already subsidized them enough, to the solar and wind industry. Right? And again, back to climate change. If the Democrats really thought there was, if the world was on fire, as they say, or the world would end soon, then all what they would do is just spend that money on nuclear energy and we'd be fine. But they don't want to do that. Why? Because it's the solar and wind special interests that buy them off. That's the truth. That's the truth. It's like, I always joke, it's amazing. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had this rock and it was really plentiful and we could mine it pretty much anywhere, including the United States, and then we just heated it up and it provided carbon-free energy for like 25 years. Oh, it's like, oh yeah, we've had that technology for a long, long time. And it's so safe, we actually stick it a reactor at a nuclear submarine and we put people hundreds and hundreds of feet below the surface. And it just goes forever, for like 25 years. It's amazing. What an amazing technology. Democrats don't like it, right? They're always speaking badly about it, trying to get you scared of it. Why is that? You should question these things. Again, it's bribery. Bribery of their special interests, bribery of the American people. They tell you that you can't be free unless you have things provided by government. You can't be free unless you have free health care, free housing, free education. And this is pretty enticing stuff to young people. It is, because look, people my age, the Gen Z generation as well, things are more expensive for us compared to our parents. They just are. There's a lot of reasons for that, but especially when it comes to healthcare, education, and housing. Part of that's because there's just more people now looking for, a scarce amount of goods. That has something to do with it. There's a lot of reasons. A lot of it is to do, though, with government intervention in those particular categories, which have caused prices to rise. If you're trying to live in California right now, where it takes 4 times as long to build an apartment building, well, then it happens to be more expensive as well than it would be, say, in Texas. So that has a lot to do with it. But the point is kids are susceptible to these arguments. They're susceptible to the arguments of utopia, to the arguments of bribery, to this notion that if we were just nice enough, we would just give you things. And that if one regulation is good, then, well, 10 must be better, because you got to take it to the big fat cats, the Scrooge McDucks, diving in their pools of gold. All right, so we raise corporate tax rates. And then Scrooge McDuck doesn't have a pool of gold. Oh, wait, yes, he still does. Because that's not what happens. You don't just take that away when you raise corporate tax rates. You know what you do take away? You take away jobs, you take away wage growth, you take away investments that have kept our economy so strong, and kept our economy strong even through COVID. When Trump left office, we were still on a path to success. And we've been stagnant because of this administration's policies. Their attacks on business, their introduction of 2,000 more regulations. Businesses don't want to do anything. They're not sure if their taxes are about to get increased. Why would you make an investment right now? This is pretty problematic stuff. The promises of utopia are always, they're not just lies, they're dangerous lies. They're dangerous, dangerous lies. We're seeing that over and over again. It's up to conservatives to remind Americans why this matters, why certain foundations matter. That's what we bring to the table. That's what we have to continue bringing to the table. And so I'll start with what I mentioned just a few minutes ago, which is the foundations of personal responsibility and fortitude. These are two closely linked concepts. And they're closely linked because it takes a sense of fortitude to even be personally responsible. It takes a degree of mental toughness to say, this is my fault. This thing that happened is my fault, or at least I'm in control of it. You can believe that there's external forces that are driving your life. You can believe that if you want, but it's a bad idea. And it's a pathway towards self-destruction. It's a pathway towards failure. But if you believe that you're in control of your own destiny, if you believe that you are accountable to yourself, that your actions actually matter, and Americans, I think, overwhelmingly believe this. It's actually one of the key tenets of American exceptionalism. If you survey Germans, for instance, they'll have a different answer for you. I've seen these surveys. It's interesting. I think conservatives especially answer the question when asked, who's in control of your destiny? You say you, not outside forces. Why is this important? Because, well, we're a nation conceived in liberty, as Abraham Lincoln said. And as a nation conceived in liberty, liberty is risky. Freedom is risky. It's hard. You got to compete with one another in a free market. You've got to be better than somebody else. Freedom is hard. And it's messy. I mean, free speech, it's messy. It's scary. People say things that hurt your feelings, make you cry, make you want to go to your safe space. Freedom is hard. And you can't survive in a free society where people are mean, when people are out competing you, when that coworker is working an hour longer than you every single day. It's so annoying. It's hard to compete with that, but that's freedom. That's freedom, and I think you'd rather have that than not. Because look, not freedom never works. Just never works. But freedom does, and we live with a sense of ordered liberty, and that's what we're trying to protect. Ordered liberty. And what does that mean? It means it's not just hedonistic freedom. I'm not a libertarian, all right? It's not pure individualism. I'm a conservative, which means I believe in ordered liberty. Liberty based in a Judeo-Christian history, a Judeo-Christian moral framework that drives our actions. Because if you're going to be free and you're going to seek some kind of higher purpose, if you're going to seek to be better than what you were yesterday, you have to have some kind of guiding light. Our country is founded on this guiding light. You know, in the House of Representatives, the Speaker's chair, right above the Speaker's chair, says, "In God we trust." It's meaningful. And right across from the Speaker, on the roof, there's portraits, these portrait reliefs of 23 lawgivers. These lawgivers are from all over history. There's like Lord Blackwell and Jefferson and Hammurabi, I mean ancient, recent. But in the middle, the only one that faces the Speaker of the House directly is Moses. And you can imagine why that is. It's the original lawgiver. And these laws are absolute. They can't be argued with. The Ten Commandments. They can't be argued with. That matters. That matters because you got to anchor yourself somewhere. Then you go from there, and then you build foundation after foundation on top of that. Conservatives are the only ones who even think this way. The only ones who recognize that to govern, you must be first realistic, and you must govern based on the principles and the policies that have actually worked in the past, even if they don't feel good, even if they're hard to sell to a big-hearted liberal young person. Doesn't matter, we have to stand by those. And we can't succumb to the temptation to do the same kind of bribery that the left does. That's populism. A lot of people have heard lately that, you know, it's good to be a populist on the right. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure where that comes from. I think we should resist that notion quite a bit. Frankly, it's how you get to this point where you had a lot of conservatives supporting $2,000 stimulus checks for people who never lost their job throughout the pandemic. That's nothing conservative about that. Now, there's a lot of populism associated with that, because imagine that, free money is popular. You know, and some on the right will define populism as, you know, doing what's right for the people, as opposed to the politicians and lobbyists and special interests. Well, that's a nice feeling to have, but here's the thing, it's meaningless. That's a meaningless statement, and I hear it all the time from the so-called populists. And the reason it's meaningless is this. Yeah, you want to do what's right for the people. Guess what? Lots of different people have different ideas of what is good for them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the people who run for office also have different philosophies and different ideas of what is best for the people. And guess what? That we then have to argue about which ones are best. And we do that through this thing called politics. So it's meaningless to say, well, I want to do what's best for the people. Everybody feels that way. Everybody feels like they're doing what's best. And the reason you should be a conservative, the reason it's the superior governing philosophy, is because there's actually a framework of how to govern. It's a process-oriented philosophy. And it's preserving the foundations of our country. Not just those moral foundations, that's what I've spent a lot of time on in this talk, is the cultural and moral foundations, the Judeo-Christian history, the sense of personal responsibility, the sense of mental toughness as a virtue, as opposed to being a victim, which is considered now a virtue on the left. So there's a clear dichotomy here. But it's more than that. It's the free market system. Again, things that actually work. Doesn't mean things are perfect. Doesn't mean that people don't get trampled on, but that's life as well. And the job of a conservative is to figure out how to get the best possible outcome in the aggregate using these principles that are known to work. The free market being one of them. But to have a free market, you need to have those foundations I talked about. You can't compete in business if you're not tough, if you're not personally responsible, and if you don't have a government that cares about certain things and has certain principles in mind, like personal property rights, like patent law, really basic stuff that are under attack by the left on a constant basis. These things actually matter quite a bit. Or the idea that maybe the role of government would be to tax you the least amount possible so that we can do our basic functions in government, as opposed to how the left thinks about it, which is, Well, you can survive if we tax you 90% of your wealth, so why don't we just take it and then we can do all the nice stuff? And that's not sustainable either. It's also a pretty quick path to making sure that no more wealth is created at all. Talking about second, third order consequences, they don't even consider these things. Our governing philosophy is simply superior to theirs, whether it's in economics, or whether it's in culture, or whether it's the way we even set up a government. So the third thing I would note is that, again, we believe in a republic, not a mob democracy. That's more important than people realize, this republic, these senses, these forms of checks and balances. The republic is what works. A pure democracy does not, because then half the tables don't get dessert, right? But a republic does work. That's what we're seeking to preserve. The Democrats are trying to destroy. Why? Why do I say that? Well, they want to pack the Supreme Court. They say that over and over again. They're trying to shame Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin into getting rid of the filibuster. Can you imagine there's only 2 Democrat senators that are actually standing in the way of that? And God bless them. But I just can't believe there's not more. This wasn't even under consideration when we were in power. Why is that? Because a guy like Mitch, and you can be mad at Mitch all day long, but the guy thinks long term. He does. Thinks pretty strategically. And when he refused to even have that vote on removing the filibuster until the Democrats, unless the Democrats do it, well, he preserved our ability to stop their legislative agenda now. And that seems obvious, I think, right? We think at least a year or 2 down the road as conservatives. That's important. And we do away with that kind of thinking at our own peril. And I know some want to. I see it. Again, they would identify themselves as the populist right. But they're not really right-wingers. They're not really conservative. They have more in common, I think, with liberals oftentimes, just because they want to partake in. We have to be more careful than that. We have to actually fight for what, and I think define better what we're fighting for. And it's those 3 things. It's the republic, it's the free market, it is these cultural values that keep us going. And I would note that these are the things that have made this country so great. This sense of freedom, this sense of individualism, it's only really been around for a couple hundred years since the Enlightenment principles first partook. And the natural state of humanity is not that. The natural state of humanity is to be tribal, is to engage in identity politics. It's to kill each other, frankly, and live in this sort of miserable state of affairs. Only in the last few hundred years did we overcome that and begin this transition to some of the greatest years of prosperity humanity's ever known. And it is the ideas of the American founding that created that. But we weren't the first ones to think of them. The cool thing about this country, the cool thing about our founding, is that it is based off of all the greatest ideas that humankind has ever had. Based off all of the great ideas from Jerusalem, where we learned moral truth, from Athens, where we learned philosophy and democracy, and from Rome, when we learned the structures of a republic and the sanctity of law, from London, where we learned common law, and the Magna Carta, where we took the idea that even kings are subject to those laws. And we wrote all those ideas down in Philadelphia in 1776, where we said why government exists. And government will exist to protect your inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the framework from which the Constitution was written, because the Constitution tells us how to govern as a republic, how to govern with limiting principles in mind. We even wrote down a lot of those rights that we talk about. We wrote them down in the Bill of Rights. A lot of our founders didn't even think that was necessary. They thought it would be self-evident that we would just protect those rights. They thought it was self-evident that government could not do these things unless it was specifically told to do them. Well, thank God they did, obviously, given the state of affairs that we're in now. The only thing standing in the way of the left's tyranny is indeed and often the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. It's a beautifully written document. In fact, it's the oldest constitution in the entire world. We're one of the youngest countries in the world, but we have one of the oldest constitutions because it has longevity, because it is based on those great ideas. And that's what we're fighting for. That's what I think you will fight for. That's what I think if you have those weekend discussions about climate change with your neighbors, always bring it back to who we are fundamentally. And conservatives need a little help, I think, sometimes with fighting. See, the left is pretty good at activism. They've been doing it for a very long time. We've sort of just started learning and just started realizing that we're in a full-fledged culture war. And too often, in that frustration that people feel, we get mad, start following the wrong people, following the clowns in Congress who just want to perform for you, make you think they're fighting for you, but really they're fighting for their own fundraising. Or follow the Instagram influencer or the pundit that really just wants to make you angry, gets you to click on whatever infuriating title that they've posted or infuriating story. And they know a couple things too. They also know the quickest way to conserve is not to attack Democrats, but to attack fellow Republicans. And they come up with words like rhino and establishment. Frankly, I think these are meaningless words, but they use them. And they use them why? One, because they know they'll get some more fundraising out of it. They know they'll get more clicks. But these are grifters. You're not used to hearing this, are you? No, you're not. Good. You're used to probably people coming up in a dinner like this and saying, I'm going to go back to Washington and first priority get them rhinos. If they say that to you, they're a grifter. They're lying to you. They're doing it on purpose because they know that that's the quickest way to a conservative's heart, because we're always looking for traitors in our midst. But it's not true. It's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people. It's not true. And they like to fake pretend like they fight, right? Really, they're performing. You go and yelling at AOC in the hallway, that's not fighting, that's performing. Fighting in politics has to mean an outcome of winning, I would assume. And what is winning in politics? Well, it's persuading more people to agree with you. That's winning. And those performers that I talk about, and you know who they are, whether on TV or on the internet or in Congress, you know who they are. Have they ever persuaded somebody to see it your way? Never. Never, not once. Think of somebody who does engage in actual persuasion. That's what I try to do. Somebody like Ben Shapiro. That's a person who actually makes arguments for the sake of persuasion, is intellectually honest. These are the kind of people that we should be following and that we should be proud of. Because fighting in politics is indeed persuasion. Let's bring this back to a kind of a war story type thing. There's a lot of veterans in the room. And I think you can connect with this notion. Is it better to die in a hail of gunfire or to win? Now here's the thing. Dying in a hail of gunfire might be easy. You get shot at and you charge the hill. You charge the hill and you look really cool. It's very hot. You're going to look really cool and you're going to keep running through those bullets until they drop you. But guess what? You're dead. No matter how cool you look, you're dead. Now, what you actually do in combat when you get shot at, okay, you're hiding behind the smallest rock that you can find. Well, the biggest rock, which ends up being small. And you don't look cool. You're like, ah! And then you get your bearings about you, right? Because you've been through this, you've trained through it. You slow your breathing, you look around, see where your teammates are at, anybody get hit? No? Okay, let's shoot, move, and communicate. And you make a plan really quick. You go through the motions that you've trained to 100 times, with hand signals or with your calls, and you set up a base of fire and a maneuver element, flank the enemy, kill them. Doesn't look that, it still looks pretty cool, because it's cool, but it doesn't look that cool, but you won. You won. And in politics, the goal is winning. And to win, you have to persuade. You have to be wittier than your opponents. You have to be more knowledgeable. We have to accept the fact that we're just on defense. We are, because we're the ones defending the founding principles. The left is always on offense. They're progressives. They want to progress towards that utopian bookshelf that I talked about. That's what they want. It'll always be that way. They're always going to be passionate, because change, the love of utopia and change and revolution, it's enticing. Makes people passionate, makes people emotional. And they know that's how they can get people, through that bribery and through that revolutionary talk. It's fun, especially for young people. And just get used to it. We shouldn't complain about it. I always hear these kind of complaints. Look, we're just not on offense. We're not on offense. We got to take it to them. But oftentimes people are asking the Republican Party to do things that would have very damaging effects in the long term. Can't do that. Got to be careful. We've got to have the long term in mind, and we've got to be persuasive. And we're in a good position, I think, to be pretty persuasive. Hell, we don't have to do anything. We just have to point to the Democrats and see what they're doing? It's not looking good for them. My only regret, and what makes me sad, and what makes you sad as well, is that these things that are good for Republicans politically, all these disasters from this administration, are unfortunately extremely bad for the country. Extremely bad. Whether it's our open border, whether it's what happened in Afghanistan and our diminishment on the world stage, or whether it's what's happening with these jobs reports, or the economy, or our oil and gas industry. And that's without any of them passing the legislation that they actually want to pass yet. We've actually been pretty successful in stopping them on all fronts, even the minority right now, because their majorities are so slim. I don't know how much longer we can keep that up. They're going to get through something on reconciliation. And then we're going to beat the crap out of them in the primaries, in the general elections in 2022 for the House. So that's the good news. The question is how much? And what do we do with that? What do we do with that to continue earning the trust of the people who switch sides? Because our base is always going to vote Republican, their base is always going to vote Democrat. There's a lot of independents, a lot more than you realize, I think, especially in Texas, that swing wildly. And they're harder to pin down. But look, I think fundamentally what they want is people who do things that work and that leave you be. That's actually a pretty good strategy. It's a pretty good message to a lot of people these days who just want to be left alone. Tell the government not to take so much of my paycheck. Tell the government not to strangle my new business as I'm just trying to grow it while they're happy to do more and more business and contracts with Amazon. Right? It's starting to make people really upset. Government, do its job, like secure the border. It's not hard. It actually isn't. It's just a matter of political will. So I think we can win. We can win, but only if we live up to the best sense of ourselves as conservatives. Only if we live up to this notion that we're there to protect the American founding, this sense of Americanism. We're the ones with the American flags in our front yards. We're the ones who defend the greatest ideas that human history ever had. Those ideas that we wrote down and created the greatest country the world has ever known. You're part of that country. God bless you. God bless Texas. Thank you for having me tonight. Really appreciate it.